Olivia Bennett grabbed my wrist so suddenly that my coffee sloshed over the rim and burned my fingers. "Hide now," she whispered, her voice barely louder than a breath. "Don't ask questions. Just get inside." Her face was pale, so pale it didn't even look real under the fluorescent lights. Olivia was always composed, always neat, always smiling politely in that careful office way. But now her eyes were wide, darting down the hallway behind me like she had seen something she wished she could unsee. "What are you—" "No time." She cut me off, pulling harder. "Please, Elaine. Now." Before I could protest, she yanked open the record storage door and pushed me inside. The smell of old paper and dust hit me immediately. Boxes stacked from floor to ceiling swallowed the narrow space, leaving just enough room for one person to stand. The door slammed shut. A second later, I heard the lock click. "If they see you," she whispered through the narrow crack before it closed completely, "it's over." Then her footsteps hurried away. My heart began pounding so loudly I was sure it would echo through the walls. I stood frozen in the darkness, trying to understand what had just happened. And then I heard footsteps. Heavy ones. Male voices. Getting closer. I pressed myself against the metal shelving, barely breathing, and leaned toward the thin seam between the door and its frame. Through the narrow sliver of light, I saw polished black shoes step into view. Then another pair. Then a third. 3 men. One of the voices made my stomach twist instantly. Daniel Mercer. "My boss. Once the numbers are replaced," he said calmly, his tone low and steady, "nobody will ever know." The words landed in my chest like cold metal. I stopped breathing. Another man spoke, his voice unfamiliar. "Investor meeting is tomorrow morning. We don't have time for delays." Mercer answered without hesitation. "You'll have the corrected reports within the hour." Corrected. Not reviewed. Not updated. Corrected. Something about the word made the hairs rise along the back of my neck. Inside the storage room, the air felt thinner with every passing second. Dust tickled my throat, but I swallowed hard to stop myself from coughing. Outside, drawers opened. Paper rustled. Someone tapped rapidly on a keyboard. "What about the internal audit logs?" another voice asked. My pulse quickened. Mercer paused for a moment before replying. "They've already been handled." Handled. That word lingered in my mind like a warning. I pressed my ear closer to the door, trying to catch every sound. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my temples, making it difficult to hear clearly. Then I heard a chair scrape sharply across the floor. "Make sure her department doesn't access this." The unfamiliar voice added, "Her department." My breath caught. Were they talking about me? A cold chill crept down my spine. I pressed my hand against my mouth, afraid even the sound of breathing might give me away. Why had Olivia shoved me in here? Why had she looked terrified? What exactly was happening outside that door? The conversation continued in low murmurs, too quiet now to make out individual words. I strained harder, leaning forward until my forehead nearly touched the metal. Then came silence. Not comfortable silence, heavy silence. The kind that made your stomach twist because you knew something wasn't finished yet. Suddenly, a loud metallic slam echoed through the room. I jerked backward instinctively, knocking into a stack of archive folders behind me. They shifted dangerously, tilting toward the floor. I lunged forward and caught them just in time. My hands shook as I steadied the stack. One wrong movement, one loud sound, and everything could fall apart. Outside, footsteps moved again. Slower this time. Measured. Closer to the door, I froze completely. For a moment, the shoes stopped just inches from the seam. I could see them clearly now, polished leather. Perfectly still. Waiting. Listening. My lungs burned from holding my breath. But I didn't dare exhale. Seconds stretched into something that felt like minutes. Then the footsteps moved away. A door opened somewhere down the hall. Closed. And silence returned. I stayed there, motionless, counting my breaths, waiting for the world outside to prove it was safe again. Finally, after what felt like forever, I heard a soft click at the lock. The door opened just enough for a narrow beam of light to cut through the darkness. Olivia stood there, her face still tight with tension. "They're gone," she whispered. "For now." I stepped out carefully, blinking against the bright office lights. "What is going on?" I demanded quietly. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned closer and said, barely audible, "You didn't hear anything." "Okay." Her eyes darted around the hallway again. Before I could respond, she turned away and walked quickly toward her desk. I stood there, confused and unsettled, trying to steady my breathing. The office looked normal. Too normal. Phones ringing, printers humming, people typing like nothing had happened, like no one had just talked about replacing numbers, like no one had locked me inside a storage room minutes earlier. I walked slowly back to my workstation, forcing myself to move casually, as if nothing unusual had happened. But my hands were still trembling slightly as I sat down. I opened the morning assignment folder on my screen. Rows of financial data filled the display, clean. Organized columns of numbers. At first glance, everything looked fine. Routine. Ordinary. But then something caught my eye. A column of figures looked slightly misaligned. Just barely. Enough to make me pause. I leaned closer to the screen. One account balance showed a timestamp updated only minutes earlier. The exact time I had been locked inside that storage room. My stomach tightened. I clicked the entry and watched the metadata load. Recent modification. No revision note. No approval trail. That wasn't procedure. That wasn't allowed. A faint memory surfaced in my mind, Mercer's voice from moments earlier. "Make sure her department doesn't access this." A cold realization spread through me slowly. They knew I was coming in early today. They planned around it. Planned around me. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. I moved the cursor toward the system access log, hesitating only for a second before clicking. A list of files appeared on the screen. Most were familiar. Routine reports. Daily reconciliations. But one name stood out immediately. It wasn't part of my standard workload. It had never appeared in my assignments before. And yet now, there it was, sitting quietly in the list like it had always belonged there. Legacy Trust Confidential. My heartbeat slowed into something heavier. Something deliberate. I stared at the file name, unable to look away. Because deep down, I already knew one thing. Whatever had just happened in that storage room was only the beginning. The words Legacy Trust Confidential stayed on my screen like a warning I couldn't ignore. I didn't open it right away. My cursor hovered over the file name, blinking steadily, as if urging me forward. Something about it felt wrong. I had worked in compliance long enough to recognize unfamiliar documents, especially ones marked confidential. Files didn't simply appear under my department without proper assignment notes. Yet this one had, and only minutes ago. My fingers rested on the mouse, but my hand felt heavier than usual, like some instinct was telling me to stop. I checked the timestamp again. Assigned at 8:17, exactly when I had been locked inside that storage room. A cold pressure formed behind my ribs. That wasn't coincidence. That was timing. Deliberate timing. I swallowed slowly and double-clicked. The file opened with a faint delay. Rows of numbers loading across the screen in clean. Orderly columns. Pension distributions. Retirement balances. Long-term employee trust allocations. At first glance, everything looked perfect. Too perfect. I leaned closer, scanning the first few rows carefully. Names. Account numbers. Dates, all aligned neatly. Professionally formatted. But something tugged at my attention. A decimal point. Slightly off-center. Barely noticeable. Most people would never catch it. But I had spent years reviewing financial records, staring at numbers until they blurred into patterns in my sleep. My eyes were trained to detect imbalance. And this was imbalance. I opened an archived version of the same report from the previous quarter and placed the two files side by side, line by line. I compared them. Most figures matched. But not all. A handful of balances showed slight differences, small enough to pass unnoticed, large enough to matter over time. Thousands of dollars here. Hundreds there. Spread across multiple accounts. I checked the revision history. Nothing. No update notes. No authorization signatures. That wasn't just unusual. That violated compliance policy completely. A slow, steady unease settled into my chest. Someone had changed these numbers without leaving a trace. I sat back slightly, rubbing my thumb along the edge of my keyboard as I thought through the implications. Retirement funds weren't casual records. They were heavily regulated, audited repeatedly, protected by layers of oversight. Unless someone had bypassed those layers, unless someone had the authority to erase evidence. A faint movement beside me made me glance up. Olivia stood at the edge of my desk. Her posture looked controlled, but her fingers were trembling slightly where they rested against the back of my chair. "Everything okay?" she asked. Her voice sounded too neutral, too rehearsed. I nodded slowly, just reviewing the legacy trust files. Her eyes flicked toward my screen fast, almost instinctive before she looked away. That one glance told me more than words ever could. She knew what I was looking at, and she was afraid of it. I tilted my head slightly. "Did anyone update these records this morning?" Olivia hesitated. "Not long, but long enough." "I don't think so," she replied quietly. The answer felt wrong the moment she said it. Her hand drifted toward her pocket as her phone vibrated. She pulled it out quickly, glanced at the screen, then turned the phone away from view. Without speaking, she deleted the message. Immediately, my stomach tightened. No hesitation. No reading it twice. Just deletion. Why erase something that fast? "Meeting starts in 10 minutes, she added, stepping back as if nothing unusual had happened. Then she walked away. I watched her go, my thoughts racing. She knew something, more than she was willing to admit. I turned back to my screen and opened the system audit logs. If numbers had been changed, there had to be a record somewhere. There always was. That was the rule. That was the safeguard. At least, it was supposed to be. The log window loaded slowly, line after line of digital history appearing in precise order. User access, file modifications, timestamps, everything documented. Except, my eyes narrowed, a gap, a clean, empty space where entries should have existed. Several minutes missing. Not overwritten, not corrupted, simply gone. My pulse quickened. That wasn't a glitch. That was removal. Deliberate removal. Only high-level administrative clearance could erase audit records. Executive-level access. No one else had that authority. I leaned closer, scrolling through additional entries, searching for anything that might explain what I was seeing. Nothing. Just the absence. Like someone had cut a piece of history out of existence. A sudden thought struck me. I returned to the trust file and scrolled down the list of employees. Names blurred past, hundreds of them. Years of service. Decades of loyalty. Lives tied to these numbers. Then I stopped. My breath caught. One name held me still. Thomas Carter. I blinked. Looked again. The letters didn't change. Didn't shift. Didn't disappear. My father's name stared back at me from the screen. For a moment, I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. That wasn't possible. My father had retired years ago. Lost his pension due to what the company had called a calculation error. That was the explanation we had been given. That was the story we had accepted. But now his name was sitting inside this file. Inside a system filled with altered numbers. My hand trembled slightly as I clicked his record. A detailed profile opened. Employment history. Department transfers. Performance notes. Everything meticulously documented. Until the final line. Termination. Administrative review. My chest tightened. Termination. That wasn't what we had been told. He hadn't been terminated. He had been forced into early retirement. That was the story. That was the official version. But here the reason field sat blank. Empty. No explanation. No documentation. Nothing. That wasn't just unusual. That was impossible. Every termination required documentation. Every review required notes. Every decision required justification. Unless someone had erased it. A faint memory surfaced in my mind. My father sitting at the kitchen table years ago, surrounded by papers. His shoulders slumped under invisible weight. They said the numbers didn't match. He had told my mother quietly. Back then, I had believed him. Trusted that the system would fix itself. Trusted that mistakes were corrected. Now I wasn't so sure. A quiet voice beside me made my skin tighten. You weren't supposed to open that file. I turned slowly. Olivia stood there again. Closer this time. Her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes filled with something deeper than fear. Regret. And something else. Something that felt dangerously close to truth. If they find out you saw that, she said quietly, they won't just correct the numbers. She leaned closer. Her breath warm against my ear. They'll correct you. I stared at my father's name on the screen until the letters blurred into something unreal. Thomas Carter. I whispered it silently to myself, as if saying it aloud might somehow change it back into a mistake. But it didn't. The record stayed exactly where it was, steady and undeniable, sitting among hundreds of other employee names like it had always belonged there. Behind me, Olivia remained very still. You weren't supposed to open that file, she repeated quietly. Her voice sounded strained, like each word cost her effort. I turned toward her slowly, studying her face more carefully now. Not just fear, not just anxiety. Something deeper sat beneath it. Guilt. Why? I asked. The word came out softer than I expected. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the hallway, scanning for movement, then leaned closer to my desk. I thought you didn't know, she whispered. That sentence hit harder than anything else she'd said so far. Didn't know. Didn't know what? My chest tightened as I turned back to the screen. My father's file remained open, the blank termination reason staring back at me like a missing confession. I clicked deeper into the record. Employment history expanded across the screen, dates stretching further back than I remembered. Transfers between departments. Years of service. More years than he had ever talked about. My breath slowed as I reached the final section. Termination, administrative review. No explanation. No notes. Nothing. That wasn't how records worked. Every termination required written documentation. Every administrative action needed justification. Unless someone erased it. A faint memory tugged at the edge of my mind. My father sitting at the kitchen table late at night. Papers spread across the surface. A single yellow lamp casting long shadows across his tired face. They said the numbers didn't match, he had murmured once. Barely loud enough for my mother to hear. I remembered how he rubbed his temples, staring down at a letter with the company logo printed across the top. My mother had paced behind him, asking questions he couldn't answer. How can they say the numbers don't match when you kept every record? She had demanded. He didn't respond right away. Just stared at the letter like it held something he couldn't fix. Back in the present. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep scrolling. Attachments tab. One unread file. I hesitated. Then clicked. A scanned document opened slowly on the screen. Old? Faded. Typed on outdated formatting. At the bottom, handwritten words appeared in dark ink. Transfer withheld, pending redistribution. My pulse began to hammer in my ears. That wasn't standard language. Not legal terminology. Not compliance wording. Redistribution. To where? To whom? I leaned closer to the screen, studying the numbers listed beneath my father's account. Reduced payout. Adjusted distribution. Lower settlement than projected. That memory returned instantly. An envelope marked Final Settlement sitting on our kitchen table years ago. I remembered how my father had opened it slowly, his face tightening as he read the amount. Much smaller than what he had expected. much smaller than what he deserved. At the time, they told him it was a clerical issue, a miscalculation. Now, staring at the screen, I felt something shift inside me. That wasn't a mistake. That was removal. Behind me, Olivia exhaled quietly. "You found it," she said. I turned toward her again. "You knew about this," I said. "Not a question. A statement." Her shoulders tensed. "I saw it years ago," she admitted softly. The confession landed heavily between us. "When?" I asked. "When I worked in records," she replied. "Junior clerk. They assigned me to archival reviews, old pension files, long-term employee settlements." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I noticed patterns," she continued. "Multiple files flagged. Payout reductions. Missing approvals." My pulse quickened. "And my father?" She nodded once. "His file was one of them." The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had moved closer without warning. "What did you do?" I asked. "I reported it," she said. The words came quickly now, almost defensive. "I filed an internal notice, submitted evidence. Everything." And her lips pressed into a thin line. Nothing happened. Silence settled between us. Heavy, uncomfortable. "They told me the investigation was being reviewed," she added quietly. Then the files disappeared. Disappeared. Just like the missing audit logs I had seen earlier. Just like the blank termination reason. My hands curled slightly against the edge of my desk. "Why didn't you tell anyone else?" I asked. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I was warned," she said. That answer chilled me more than anything else. Before I could respond, movement caught my attention on the screen. A surname further down the list looked familiar. Not personal, but repeated. I scrolled carefully. Another reduced payout. Another administrative review. Another missing explanation. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just my father. There were others. Dozens of them. Years of employees. People who had trusted the system. People who believed their futures were secure. All quietly reduced. Quietly erased. "Look at this," I whispered. Olivia leaned closer. Her breath caught as she read the names. "I told you," she murmured. It wasn't just one case. The hallway outside suddenly filled with footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Both of us froze. Through the glass partition, I saw a security officer moving slowly past the cubicles, his eyes scanning computer screens one by one. That wasn't routine. That was surveillance. Olivia stepped back quickly. "They're watching more closely today," she whispered. My pulse raced again as I minimized the file. But before the window disappeared, something caught my eye. A small hidden tab at the bottom of the record. Notes section. Barely visible. I clicked it quickly. A single line appeared on the screen. "Transfer phase incomplete. Replace remaining accounts before investor review." The words hit like a physical blow. Replace remaining accounts. Investor review. This wasn't history. This was ongoing. Still happening. Still active. Olivia leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "They ruined people," she whispered. "Not just finances. Lives. Families. Trust." I stared at the words again, my chest tightening with a strange mixture of anger and clarity. This was bigger than numbers. Bigger than accounting. This was theft hidden behind spreadsheets. Before I could process further, Olivia reached into her pocket and pulled something small from inside. She slid it carefully across my desk. An old plastic card. Scratched. Faded. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Employee ED. Thomas Carter. My father's name stared back at me once again. But this time, another marking stood beneath it, stamped in faded red ink. Audit flagged. My throat tightened as I stared at the stamp. That had never been shown to us. Never mentioned. Never explained. "They erased the evidence once," Olivia whispered softly. I looked down at the card again, feeling something shift deep inside my chest. Not fear. Not confusion. Resolve. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible now, but they never erased everything. I kept staring at the red stamp on my father's employee card until the letters burned into my memory. Audit flagged. Those 2 words explained years of silence, years of confusion, years of unanswered questions that had hung over my family like unfinished business. My fingers tightened around the worn plastic edge as something inside me shifted from shock into focus. If they erased records once, they could erase them again. That thought pushed me into motion. I returned to my computer slowly, forcing my breathing to stay steady. My hands hovered above the keyboard for a moment before I reopened the Legacy Trust files. This time, I wasn't reading. I was saving. Every relevant file opened one by one. Pension distributions, executive approval logs, historical trust allocations. Each document carried weight now, evidence, not information. As I began copying the files into a hidden folder, a small warning message flickered across my screen. Restricted file access detected. My heart slammed against my ribs. The message vanished almost instantly. But the damage was done. Someone, or something, had noticed. I glanced toward the hallway instinctively. Employees moved between desks as usual. Printers humming. Phones ringing. Everything looked normal. Too normal? That kind of quiet always meant someone was watching. I renamed each file carefully, replacing obvious titles with neutral labels that wouldn't attract attention. Budget draft. Quarterly summary. Routine names that blended into thousands of others. Every click felt louder than it should have. Every second felt shorter. I opened another document, scanning quickly, selecting the sections most critical to proving unauthorized transfers. Then I saved copies into a compressed folder, encrypting the data under a password I had never used before. The cursor blinked steadily while the system processed the command. Processing. Processing. Too slow. My pulse pounded in my ears as the progress bar crawled forward. 30%. 42%. 58%. I glanced over my shoulder again. That's when Olivia approached. She placed a paper coffee cup beside my keyboard without speaking. Her expression remained neutral, her posture professional. But something about the way she moved felt deliberate. As she stepped away, the cup shifted slightly. A folded slip of paper appeared beneath it. I didn't touch it immediately. I kept my hands moving across the keyboard, pretending to remain focused on my screen. Only after several seconds did I lift the cup casually and unfold the paper beneath it. Use external storage, not company drive. My chest tightened. She wasn't just worried. She was planning. I reached into my desk drawer carefully and retrieved a small USB drive I had kept for emergencies. It had been sitting unused for months, forgotten among cables and old office supplies. Now it felt like the most important object in the room. I plugged it into the port beneath my monitor. The system recognized the device immediately. Transfer ready. I selected the encrypted folder and began copying the contents. A thin blue bar stretched across the screen. 1%. 3%. 5%. Too slow. Every second dragged like minutes. I kept my posture steady, pretending to scroll through routine spreadsheets while the transfer continued in the background. Across the room, Olivia moved between desks, answering calls, speaking calmly to coworkers. Anyone watching would assume everything was normal, but her movements were too controlled, too precise, like she was buying me time. The progress bar climbed slowly. 27%, 41%, 59%. My fingers tapped lightly against the desk, trying to hide the tension building inside my chest. Then my phone vibrated quietly inside my pocket. I ignored it at first, focused on the transfer. 72%, 78%. Finally, when the progress bar reached 94%, I pulled the phone from my pocket and glanced at the screen. Martin Hale, corporate compliance attorney. I hadn't spoken to him in months. The message preview read, "Call only from secure line." My throat tightened. That wasn't a casual response. That was a warning. The transfer completed moments later. 100%. I exhaled slowly, ejecting the USB drive and slipping it back into my pocket. The weight of it against my leg felt reassuring, proof that the evidence existed somewhere beyond their reach. For now, I stood from my chair, forcing my movements to appear routine. Restroom, I murmured quietly to no one in particular, already walking toward the hallway. The farther I moved from my desk, the heavier the silence felt. Halfway down the corridor, I noticed something waiting on my chair when I turned briefly to look back. An envelope. Plain. White. Unmarked. My pulse spiked instantly. That hadn't been there before. I returned slowly, careful not to attract attention. The envelope rested exactly in the center of my chair like it had been placed deliberately. No name. No handwriting. Just paper. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up. Inside was a single sheet. Printed. Sharp black letters across the center. Stop digging, or your past becomes public. My breath caught in my throat. The words felt heavier than the paper itself. How did they know? Who placed this here? What past were they talking about? A chill ran down my spine as I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was intimidation. Before I could fully process the threat, a notification appeared across my monitor. Company-wide email. Subject line: Emergency internal audit. My stomach tightened. The message instructed all departments to maintain full access visibility and prepare for immediate compliance review. That wasn't routine. That was containment. I looked toward Olivia again. She stood near the far cubicle, reading the same message. Her face went pale, the same way it had that morning. They're locking things down, she whispered as she approached. Her voice sounded thinner now, stretched tight with fear. I swallowed hard. If they locked the system, evidence could disappear. And if evidence disappeared, everything we had done would vanish with it. I stepped into the restroom minutes later, locking myself inside the stall before pulling out my phone. My fingers shook slightly as I dialed Martin's number. He answered on the second ring. Talk fast, he said quietly. I found altered pension records, I whispered. Executive level overrides. Missing audit logs. There was a brief pause. Then his voice hardened. Do not trust your internal systems. The words settled heavily in my chest. I've secured external copies, I replied. Good, he said. Keep gathering proof. Don't report internally yet. Another pause. Internal reports disappear when the wrong people control them. I leaned back against the cold stall wall, absorbing the weight of his warning. This wasn't just corruption. This was systemic. When I returned to my desk, something felt wrong immediately. Too quiet. Too still. My screen was awake, but I hadn't touched the mouse. A window sat open across the center of the monitor. System access history. Not minimized. Not hidden. Open. My stomach dropped. Someone had accessed my account. Recently. Without my permission. Footsteps approached quickly behind me. I turned just as Olivia rushed toward my desk, her face tight with fear. They're reviewing employee access logs, she whispered urgently. My chest tightened. She leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. They started with yours. I felt the air thin around me. If they connect you to those files, she added quietly. Her eyes met mine, grim, uncertain. They won't just fire you. A pause followed. Then she whispered the words that made my blood run cold. They'll destroy your credibility before you can speak. My login screen froze for a second before flashing a new message across the center. Account activity under review. The words sat there like a verdict already written. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering above the keyboard, unsure whether touching anything would make things worse. Around me, the office had shifted in ways that felt subtle but unmistakable. People whispered in small groups near the printers. Managers moved quickly between departments without stopping to chat. Security officers, 2 of them now, walked slowly along the aisles, their eyes sweeping across desks as if searching for something hidden in plain sight. For the first time since this began, I felt exposed. Not suspicious. Not cautious. Exposed. My heart beat harder with every passing second as I watched the message blink once before disappearing. The screen returned to normal. But nothing about this felt normal anymore. A new email notification popped up in the corner. Subject: Data Integrity Breach Investigation. My throat tightened as I opened it. Employees are instructed to remain at workstations. Avoid accessing restricted files. Unauthorized review activity has been detected. Unauthorized review activity. That phrase echoed loudly in my mind. Someone had flagged access logs. Someone had seen movement inside the system. And now everyone was being watched. I glanced around the office carefully. Several coworkers avoided looking in my direction. Others glanced quickly and looked away the moment I noticed. Rumors traveled faster than facts. And once suspicion started, it rarely stopped where it began. A sudden alert appeared across my screen. Security audit required. Immediate response. My pulse spiked. The system automatically opened my activity history without me touching anything. Lines of data scrolled downward in neat, unforgiving order. Timestamps. User IDs. File names. Then I saw it. 237 of hour. Unauthorized access. User: Elaine Carter. My breath stopped. That wasn't possible. At that hour, I had been asleep in my apartment, miles away from this building. Yet the system showed activity tied directly to my credentials. Scrolling. File downloads. Restricted folder access. Evidence pointing directly at me. A slow chill crept through my chest. Someone had used my identity. Not borrowed. Not mistaken. Used. I leaned back slightly in my chair, forcing myself to breathe evenly despite the panic clawing at my ribs. This wasn't coincidence. This was setup. Intentional. Carefully designed. I turned instinctively toward Olivia's desk. Empty. Her chair pushed neatly beneath the workstation. Computer locked. No coffee cup. No bag. No scattered papers. Everything gone. Too clean. Too final. I stood slowly, trying to keep my movements natural as I walked toward her desk. Up close, the absence felt louder than noise. Even the small framed photo she kept beside her monitor had disappeared. She hadn't stepped out. She'd been removed. I approached a nearby coworker, keeping my voice low. Have you seen Olivia today? He avoided eye contact immediately. They reassigned her. He muttered quickly. Temporary thing. Reassigned. Without notice. Without warning. Without a trace. The explanation sounded rehearsed. Like something memorized rather than believed. A tight pressure settled in my chest. My only ally was gone, and I was standing alone. Footsteps approached behind me. Measured. Controlled. I turned slowly. Daniel Mercer stood just a few feet away, his expression calm in that controlled, executive way that hid everything beneath a polished surface. Elaine, he said evenly. We need to talk. The words carried weight. Not casual. Not optional. I followed him down the hallway toward a small conference room. The door closed behind us with a soft but final click. Inside, another executive sat at the table. A security officer stood near the door. My pulse pounded harder. This wasn't a conversation. This was interrogation. Mercer slid a printed document across the table toward me. Highlighted lines marked sections in bright yellow. My name appeared again and again. Elaine Carter. User ID. EC4172. Unauthorized access detected. I stared at the page, forcing my breathing to stay steady. Your account accessed restricted trust files without authorization, Mercer said calmly. His tone remained controlled. Neutral. But there was sharpness beneath it. Can you explain that? I lifted my eyes slowly. I followed assigned workflow. I replied carefully. Not defensive. Not emotional. Professional. The second executive leaned forward slightly. We've noticed irregular behavior tied to your account activity, he said coldly. This raises serious concerns about procedural compliance. Procedural compliance. Corporate language for blame. For liability. For removal. My throat tightened, but I kept my posture steady. Inside, panic scraped against my ribs. They weren't asking questions. They were building a case, constructing a narrative, piece by piece, just like they had done years ago. A memory surfaced without warning. My father sitting silently at the kitchen table, staring down at official letters he didn't understand. The same helpless frustration, the same quiet disbelief, the same unanswered accusations. History repeating itself. I stepped out of the room minutes later under the excuse of gathering additional records. The hallway felt colder now, quieter, more dangerous. I slipped into the restroom and locked myself inside a stall. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the cold metal divider, steadying my breathing. Then my phone vibrated. Unknown number. A message appeared across the screen. You were warned. The words hit harder than anything else that morning. They knew? Not suspected. Knew. My chest tightened as anger replaced fear. Not explosive anger. Cold anger. Focused. They were not investigating. They were silencing. Moments later, another email arrived. Subject: Employee investigation notice. I opened it slowly, reading each line with growing dread. Mandatory interview scheduled. Device audit ordered. Access privileges restricted. Failure to cooperate may result in termination. Termination. The word carried finality. Consequences. Erasure. When I returned to my desk, something felt wrong immediately. Too quiet. Too still. I opened my drawer, reaching instinctively for the USB drive. My fingers brushed empty space. I froze. Looked again. Shifted papers. Moved cables. Nothing. The USB was gone. My pulse slammed violently against my ribs. Someone had been inside my desk. Someone had taken it. The only copy of my defense? Gone. I sat there, staring into the empty drawer, feeling the weight of realization settle heavily into my chest. They weren't just accusing me. They were erasing me. And somewhere in this building, the only proof of my innocence was already in the wrong hands. I sat frozen in front of my open drawer, staring into the empty space where the USB drive had been. For a few seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even breathe properly. If the drive was gone, then everything I had gathered, every file, every log, every piece of proof was gone with it. My defense, my father's truth, my only shield against what they were building around me, erased in one silent motion. A faint flicker crossed my computer screen. I looked up instinctively. For just a second, a small notification appeared in the corner. Remote archive access initiated. Then it disappeared. My heart slammed against my ribs. Someone was already moving through the system. Already searching. Already cleaning. The speed of it terrified me more than the theft itself. They weren't reacting slowly. They were acting like professionals who had done this before. Like people who knew exactly how to erase history. I pushed my chair back slowly, forcing my breathing to stay steady. Panic wouldn't help me now. Panic was exactly what they wanted. A faint movement behind me made me turn sharply. Olivia stood there, breathing fast, hair slightly disheveled. Not calm, not composed. Alive. Relief flooded my chest so suddenly it almost hurt. "You're back," I whispered. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder before stepping closer to my desk. "They searched my desk," she said quietly. Her voice trembled just enough to betray the fear beneath her control. My chest tightened. "They suspended my access," she added. "Told me to leave the floor until further notice. Not reassigned. Suspended. Punished." I swallowed hard. "My USB is gone." Olivia didn't look surprised. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out something small. Familiar. Rectangular. My breath caught. "The USB drive." "I took it," she whispered. For a moment, I just stared at it, unable to process what I was seeing. "You took it." She nodded once. Before they could, relief washed over me in a wave so strong it made my knees feel weak. I saw security reviewing workstation logs, she continued. They were checking desk access times. I knew they'd come for yours. She placed the drive carefully into my hand. I wasn't stealing it, she said quietly. I was protecting it. I closed my fingers around the drive slowly, feeling its solid weight settle into my palm. For the first time all morning, I felt something shift. Not safety, but possibility. You risked everything, I whispered. So did your father? She replied. Her words hit harder than expected. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? Olivia hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice dropping lower. Years ago, when I worked in records, there was an internal audit review. My chest tightened. What kind of review? Quiet, she said. Unofficial. Files flagged internally but never reported publicly. A cold tension spread through my body as she continued. They were investigating pension reallocations, she explained. Multiple accounts showing unexplained reductions. Not one case. Multiple, not an error. A pattern. My father was one of them, I said slowly. She nodded. Yes. The word landed heavily between us. He wasn't random, she continued. He was part of a flagged group, long-term employees whose accounts were marked for adjustment. Adjustment. Another corporate word hiding theft. My fingers tightened around the USB. Who authorized it? I asked. Olivia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward my monitor and opened a secured folder. Look. A scanned document appeared on the screen. Old. Formal. Stamped with executive approval codes. At the bottom sat a signature. Clean. Sharp. Unmistakable. Daniel Mercer. My chest tightened painfully. He signed it, I whispered. Olivia nodded once. Years before he became your direct supervisor, she said. Back when he handled restructuring approvals. The room felt smaller. Colder. More dangerous. I stared at the signature again, unable to look away. My father had trusted that company. Worked decades without complaint. Believed loyalty meant protection. And Mercer had signed the document that stripped his future away. A memory surfaced, my father sitting quietly in the living room one evening, staring at a letter without speaking. They said there wasn't enough left. He had told my mother once. Now I knew the truth. There had been enough. They had taken it. Olivia clicked another file. Tables filled the screen, numbers moving between accounts, shifting across columns in patterns too structured to be accidental. Look here, she said. I leaned closer. Funds removed from employee pensions. Transferred into investment holding accounts. Executive controlled. Hidden behind corporate growth figures. They used retirement funds to inflate performance numbers, Olivia whispered. My pulse quickened. Artificial success built on stolen futures. Not just theft. Fraud sustaining reputation. Fraud sustaining power. Fraud sustaining careers. I swallowed hard. This goes deeper than I thought. She nodded slowly. Much deeper. My phone vibrated quietly inside my pocket. Martin. I stepped aside and answered quickly. I have executive signatures, I whispered. Proof of redirected pension funds. There was silence on the other end. Then his voice hardened. You now have probable cause. My stomach tightened. For what? I asked. For federal review, he replied. The words landed heavily. Federal, not internal, not corporate. Government-level consequences. Do not confront anyone yet, he continued. Wait until the investor signing meeting. Why? Because public exposure prevents quiet burial, he said. Private reports disappear. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of his warning. Timing mattered now. Not just proof, not just truth. Timing. When I returned to the screen, Olivia had opened another document, a final file hidden deep within the archive. Employee transfer beneficiaries. I clicked it open. Names filled the page. Executives. Managers. Senior leadership. Each listed beside private trust accounts. Amounts transferred. Amounts accumulated. My breath caught. Those funds came from somewhere. From employees? From pensions? From futures? They enriched themselves, I whispered. Olivia nodded slowly. Yes. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Faster this time. More urgent. Olivia stiffened. They're locking down access to the trust servers, she whispered. My pulse surged. Time closing. Options shrinking. I quickly saved the final file copy onto the USB drive. Hands steady despite the pounding in my chest. As the progress bar reached completion, a single realization settled firmly into my mind. Tomorrow's investor meeting was our last chance. Because if we failed, if we waited, if we hesitated, the truth would disappear. And this time, it would be gone forever. The lobby felt colder than usual when I walked through the glass doors the next morning. People moved with unusual urgency. Their voices hushed, their expressions tight. Investors stood in small clusters near the reception desk, dressed in dark suits and quiet confidence. Security officers lined the walls, watching everything without appearing to watch anything at all. A large banner hung above the main corridor. Strategic Partnership Signing Ceremony. The words looked polished and proud, but all I could see beneath them was deception dressed as success. I tightened my grip around my bag as I moved toward the elevators. Inside my pocket, the USB drive pressed against my palm like a steady reminder of why I was here. Not fear, not survival. Truth. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside beside a group of executives whispering to each other. No one acknowledged me. No one smiled. Everyone was waiting for something. Or someone. When the doors opened on the executive floor, I stepped out into a corridor that felt heavier than air itself. Olivia stood near the wall, pretending to review a clipboard. When she saw me, her eyes flickered briefly with recognition. No words, just a small movement of her hand. She passed me quickly, brushing against my shoulder as if by accident. Something slipped into my hand. I looked down. A second USB drive. Backup. Insurance. Smart. I closed my fingers around it without breaking stride. They locked the servers overnight, she whispered as she walked past me. But external copies are safe. That was all I needed to hear. I continued forward toward the boardroom. Large glass doors stood open, revealing the long, polished table inside. Investors sat in neat rows, documents stacked neatly in front of them. Lawyers lined the far wall, speaking quietly among themselves. Daniel Mercer stood at the head of the table, reviewing paperwork with calm precision. Until he saw me. His expression shifted for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Surprise, then irritation, then control. He recovered quickly, masking his reaction behind the same polished professionalism he always carried. I stepped inside without hesitation. Every chair was occupied except one near the far end. I took it quietly, placing my bag beside my feet. No one asked why I was there. Not yet. A presentation began at the front of the room. Charts filled the large projection screen. Profit growth, investment stability, expansion projections. Numbers climbed upward in smooth, confident lines, but I recognized them instantly. Altered data, manufactured strength, fraud displayed as achievement. My pulse slowed into something steady, focused, cold. As the final presentation slide faded, folders were distributed along the table. Signature pages placed neatly in front of each investor. Pens aligned. Ready? Daniel Mercer stepped forward. Thank you for your confidence, he said smoothly. We look forward to a long and prosperous partnership. His voice carried confidence, authority, control. Until I stood up. The sharp scrape of my chair against the polished floor echoed louder than expected. Every head turned. Silence fell instantly. I request a delay, I said. My voice remained steady, louder than I expected, clearer than I felt. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. This is not the appropriate time, he began. It is exactly the appropriate time, I replied calmly. A ripple of tension moved through the room. Investors exchanged glances, Lawyers leaned forward slightly. Mercer's voice sharpened. "Sit down, Elaine." I didn't move. Instead, I walked toward the projector table and connected my laptop. For one brief second, I hesitated. Not from fear, from certainty. Once this started, there would be no turning back. The screen flickered, then filled with files. Executive approval records, pension reduction logs, transfer authorizations, all displayed clearly for everyone in the room. Murmurs spread immediately. "What is this?" one investor asked sharply. "Financial records." I answered. "Historical trust reallocations." My hands remained steady as I clicked through document after document. Dates, signatures, amounts, logical sequence, unavoidable proof. The data presented in today's projections includes funds redirected from employee retirement accounts. I continued. Silence deepened. Eyes narrowed. Mercer stepped forward quickly. "This is unauthorized access to confidential material," he snapped. "These records are incomplete and misleading." His tone had changed now. Less controlled. More aggressive. Security officers shifted slightly closer. I could feel the tension tightening around me like invisible wires. "You fabricated this," Mercer continued sharply. "You accessed restricted files without authorization." He turned toward the investors. "This employee has demonstrated repeated procedural violations. Character assassination. Predictable. Calculated. But expected." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened another file. One more click. One more page. Then footsteps echoed sharply behind me. Olivia entered the room. Her face pale but determined. She carried a stack of printed documents clutched tightly against her chest. Every head turned toward her. She walked directly to the table without hesitation and placed the papers in front of the lead investor. Original audit reports. Stamped. Signed. Undeniable. The room went silent again. He flipped through the pages slowly, his expression hardening with every turn. "This document confirms internal awareness of pension redistribution," he said coldly. Mercer froze. For the first time since this began, his composure cracked. "You suppressed an internal investigation," the investor continued. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Lawyers stood. Chairs shifted. Pens lowered. The signing ceremony stopped. Completely. Mercer stepped backward slowly. "I can explain." "You will." The investor interrupted sharply. "But not here." A security officer moved forward. "Not toward me." "Toward him." "Sir," the officer said firmly, "we need you to remain here." Mercer's face drained of color. For the first time, he looked unsure. Power shifted in that moment. Not gradually. Instantly. The authority he once carried dissolved into something fragile. Something temporary. Around the room, investors whispered urgently among themselves. Phones appeared in hands. Messages were sent rapidly. Control had changed sides, but consequences had only begun. And standing there in the center of that room, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. The truth didn't need volume. It didn't need anger. It only needed evidence. And once it was seen, it could never be unseen. No one spoke for several long seconds after the security officer stepped in front of Daniel Mercer. The room felt suspended in time, as if the air itself had thickened. Investors remained seated, their expressions tight with controlled anger. Lawyers moved quietly along the edges of the room, collecting documents and whispering into phones. Mercer opened his mouth again, but the lead investor raised his hand sharply. "That's enough," he said. The authority in his voice carried across the room like a command that could not be ignored. Mercer lowered his head slightly, his confidence drained. His posture no longer sharp and commanding, but stiff and uncertain. For years, he had controlled outcomes from behind polished conference tables. Now he stood in front of one, powerless. "All signing procedures are suspended," the investor continued, effective immediately. A ripple of movement spread across the room. Pens were set down, folders closed, Conversations began in hushed tones. This wasn't just delay. This was collapse. One of the external legal advisors stepped forward, introducing himself formally. His voice remained calm but precise. "We will initiate an independent forensic audit," he announced. "All trust-related financial records will be secured pending investigation." Mercer shifted slightly, attempting to step away from the table. A security officer blocked his path without hesitation. "Sir, please remain here." Mercer's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. For the first time since I had known him, he looked like a man who understood he had lost control. Around me, executives who once walked with effortless confidence now avoided eye contact. Their faces carried the same tension I had lived with for days: uncertainty, fear, exposure. Phones rang across the room. Messages spread quickly. Damage control had begun, but it was too late. Within hours, the fallout moved through the building like a shockwave. Security officers sealed Mercer's office with a printed notice taped across the door. Access cards were deactivated. System privileges revoked. Employees gathered quietly in hallways, whispering in cautious tones. Some looked stunned. Others looked relieved. And many looked angry. Questions that had remained buried for years began to surface. What happened to our pension adjustments? Why were accounts reduced? Who approved those transfers? Voices grew louder with each passing hour. Truth has a way of multiplying once it escapes silence. Later that afternoon, I received an official email. Subject: Investigation status update. My fingers hovered briefly before opening it. Employee Elaine Carter has been cleared of misconduct. I read the line twice. Then a third time. Relief settled into my chest like warmth returning after a long winter. Weeks of pressure, fear, accusation. Doubt began to lift slowly. The message continued. System access restored. Investigation against employee terminated. Formal apology issued. Not spoken. Not whispered. Written. Recorded. Permanent. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes briefly. For the first time since this began, I felt safe enough to breathe deeply. My phone rang later that evening. "Martin." I answered immediately. "They've opened historical case reviews," he said calmly. "Multiple pension records are being re-examined." My chest tightened. "Including your father's," he added. The words hit harder than I expected. I sat quietly, gripping the edge of my desk. "Funds previously withheld are eligible for restoration," he continued. "Even posthumously." My throat tightened. For a moment, I couldn't respond. Not because I lacked words, because emotion filled every space inside my chest. Justice delayed, but not denied. That evening, I drove to the cemetery just before sunset. The sky stretched wide above me, painted in fading shades of gold and gray. The air carried a gentle chill, the kind that made everything feel quieter, more honest. I walked slowly along the path, carrying a single envelope in my hand. Inside it sat the official notice confirming my father's restored pension record. His name printed clearly. Corrected. Acknowledged. I stopped in front of his grave. For several seconds, I simply stood there, looking, remembering, feeling. Memories returned quietly, his steady voice, his patience, the way he always believed fairness would eventually find its way back. I knelt slowly, brushing my fingers across the cool stone. "They told the truth," I whispered. The words came naturally, not rehearsed, not dramatic, just honest. "I found it," I added softly. "The proof they tried to erase." I placed the envelope gently against the base of the stone. The wind moved lightly across the grass, carrying a quiet sound through the trees. Not loud, not sharp, just steady, like breathing, like time. Justice didn't erase the years he struggled. It didn't return lost moments. But it restored something just as important: dignity, truth, honor. In the weeks that followed, the company changed in ways few had expected. New leadership replaced old executives. Compliance departments expanded. Transparency committees formed to review long-term financial practices. Mercer and several others faced formal charges. Not rumors, not speculation. Charges. The kind that required answers under oath. I was offered a position within the newly formed Compliance Review Task Force. At first, I hesitated. Not because I doubted my ability, because I understood the responsibility. Accepting meant staying in the place where everything began, facing the same system that once tried to silence me. But this time, with authority built on truth, I accepted. Not for recognition, not for reward, but to make sure no one else's father sat at a kitchen table wondering where their future had gone. Months later, the office felt different, quieter, more cautious, more transparent. Employees spoke openly about records, procedures, accountability. Trust didn't return overnight, but it began to grow, slowly, carefully, one honest step at a time. Sometimes, I still thought about the moment Olivia grabbed my wrist and pushed me into that storage room. If she hadn't, if I had ignored the file, if fear had won, none of this would have happened. Silence would have protected corruption, and truth would have stayed buried. Instead, one decision changed everything. Not because I was fearless, but because I acted despite fear. And if you've ever faced a moment where you knew something wasn't right, where staying quiet felt easier than speaking up, then you understand how heavy those choices can feel. So tell me this, if you had been standing where I stood, hearing what I heard, seeing what I saw, would you have stayed silent to protect yourself? Or risked everything to protect the truth? Share your thoughts below. I read every story, and you'd be surprised how many people carry moments like this inside them. And if this story reminded you that integrity still matters, if it made you believe that truth can outlast power, then stay with this channel. There are more stories ahead. Stories about courage, accountability, and the quiet strength people discover when everything is on the line. Subscribe if you believe justice is worth fighting for. Because sometimes, the right story at the right moment can give someone the courage to do what's right when it matters most.